So what makes a book truly sacred? I mean, who gets to decide what belongs in the Bible and what gets left out? And here's a really wild thought. Can a book be read, respected, even quoted in the Bible, but still not be in the Bible for most people? It sounds like a paradox, right?
Hmm.
But that's exactly what we're diving into today with the Book of Enoch. It's this powerful, really poetic text, sometimes controversial. Early Christians, many of them cherished it. But now,
Yeah.
honestly, most people haven't even heard of it.
Yeah, and that's exactly why this is such a fascinating deep dive to take. We're not really here to argue, should it be in, should it be out? That's not the point. It's more of an invitation, really, to reflect on how Scripture itself came together.
Yeah.
So our mission today is kind of exploring three main things. Why was it so popular in the early church? Then why did it eventually, fall out of favor for most traditions? And maybe most importantly, what does its really curious history tell us today about how people understood sacred texts back then, how they were chosen? It forces you to think, respectfully about the whole process. It wasn't simple.
Okay, yeah, let's unpack that. Because for a lot of us listening, this book probably feels like it just popped out of thin air. Where did this thing actually come from?
Right, it does feel that way now.
Yeah.
But it has a pretty distinct history, though. It's complicated. Most scholars think that the book we call Enoch wasn't written all at once. It was likely put together bit by bit, maybe between, say, 300 BCE and 100 BCE. It's really important to get that it probably wasn't a single author sitting down. It's what they call a layered text. So different people adding parts over time, maybe even over centuries, which, wasn't super unusual for ancient writings, but it definitely made things tricky later when people were trying to figure out, like, is this the inspired word from one single divine source?
Ah, okay. So not one writer, but kind of a collection built over time. That definitely adds a wrinkle right from the start.
Absolutely. And what's really amazing about how it survived is that the full version, the most complete one we have, only exists in Gez. That's an old Ethiopic language. Think of it like kind of the Latin for the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. It's their sacred language, and they preserve texts that got lost or sidelined elsewhere. And get this, it's still part of their Bible canon today, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which is pretty unique worldwide. But back in the day, way back, it was read super widely. Jewish communities, early Christian groups. It wasn't some obscure little text at all.
That's incredible. So it was really common currency, spiritually speaking, for a long time. But that just makes the puzzle deeper, doesn't it? If it was that well known, if its ideas were circulating, how did it just vanish from most Bibles? And crucially, what about connections to the New Testament? You hear whispers about that. Were there actual link quotes even? That's where I get really curious.
You've nailed the mystery right there. The influence is, well, it's hard to deny when you look closely. And the direct connections, yeah, they're kind of astounding. We know early Christian writers mentioned it. Big names like Tertullian, he was a major early Latin theologian, and Justin Martyr, an important apologist. They knew it. But here's the kicker, the really crucial bit. The Book of Enoch is directly quoted in the New Testament.
Yeah.
Specifically, you look in the Epistle of Jude, verses 14 and 15. It quotes Enoch, word for word almost, talking about the Lord coming with his holy myriads for judgment.
Whoa, hang on. So a book that's not in my Bible, or most Bibles today, is actually quoted inside the Bible. That just blows up a lot of assumptions about how the Bible is formed, doesn't it?
Wow. It really does. It makes Enoch pretty unique in that sense. A direct quote right there in the New Testament from a book that ultimately didn't make the final cut for most traditions. It's just a powerful reminder that the lines around what was Scripture were maybe more fluid, more porous back then than we sometimes imagine. And the connections don't even stop there. If you read Enoch, you start seeing these really striking echoes, images, themes, especially in places like 1 Peter, 2 Peter, and definitely the Book of Revelation. We're talking about things like angels being held in chains, waiting for Judgment Day, really detailed pictures of divine judgment, these grand heavenly visions. All that stuff is explored really deeply in Enoch. It shows how much its ideas were just part of the air they breathed, influencing the language, the metaphors the New Testament writers used.
Okay, so it wasn't just known, it was influential enough to be quoted directly, and its ideas pop up elsewhere. So then the big question remains, if it was that important, what happened? What pushed it out? Why isn't it in most canons today?
Yeah, it's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it points to this whole gradual, often messy process of canon formation. One of the biggest reasons that scholars point to for its eventual rejection revolves around authorship and authenticity. The book says it's by Enoch, right? The guy from Genesis 5 who walked with God and was no more. But, well, it was pretty clearly written much, much later than when Enoch would have lived, centuries later. And for early Christians trying to define inspired, that was a problem. If it wasn't really written by the person it claimed, could it truly be divinely authoritative? That link was crucial for them. So that anachronism, that historical mismatch, wasn't just a minor detail. It raised fundamental questions about its divine origin.
Right, so if it wasn't genuinely from Enoch, that raises red flags about authenticity. It makes sense. But was it just that? Or is there something in the content itself that maybe made people a bit uncomfortable, maybe too challenging for the structure they were trying to build?
That's definitely another big piece of the puzzle, yeah. Some of the content was seen as, let's say, speculative, maybe even a bit extreme for some. You have to remember the context. The early church was dealing with all sorts of different ideas floating around, like Gnosticism, which often had these really elaborate cosmic stories and secret knowledge. The church leaders were trying to establish clarity, kind of core, consistent theological framework. And Enoch, well, it gets into some really specific stuff, like incredibly detailed maps of the cosmos, the heavens, the storehouses for wind and snow, the paths of the stars. It goes deep into the story of angelic sin, even naming fallen angels, the Watchers, and describing how they came down, mingled with humans, and fathered these giant hybrid beings, the Nephilim. Plus, it has these very intense, sometimes graphic, apocalyptic visions that go beyond what's in other accepted texts. So all this really imaginative, detailed, sometimes fantastical stuff. While it's clearly compelling to many, some leaders probably felt it was just maybe too much, too elaborate, too potentially confusing or distracting from the core message they were trying to solidify.
Okay, so a mix of questionable authorship and content that was just a lot. Maybe kind of wild, a bit too distinct for the standardizing theological framework they were aiming for.
Exactly. You put your finger on it. The very things that made it fascinating and powerful for some readers might have made it problematic for others who were focused on doctrinal unity and clarity. And another factor, it didn't really align with the Jewish canon, the Hebrew Bible, which was becoming more defined, especially after the temple destruction in 70 AD. As Christianity increasingly distinguished itself from Judaism, books not accepted in the Jewish canon faced more scrutiny within Christian circles too. So by the 4th century or so, after lots of debate in different church councils, Enoch was largely left out of most official Christian lists of scripture. It wasn't like a switch flipped overnight. It was gradual, decades, centuries of discussion, prayer, reaction to different crises. Still hung around, influential in some ways, but not usually as capital S scriptures, except, as we said, in Ethiopia, which just highlights how different communities sometimes made different choices about what they needed in their sacred collection.
Wow. This whole story just brings up some really deep questions for us today, doesn't it? It kind of shakes up our neat categories. Like, why would early Christians quote and value a book that later gets excluded, almost banned from most Bibles? Can something be really spiritually meaningful for people genuinely shaping their faith and imagination, but not be considered canonically authoritative? Does leaving a book out automatically mean it's, like, dangerous? Or could it just mean it was hard to fit into the structure they were building? And where does that leave room for things like mystery, symbolism, maybe even wild imagination in how we think about God revealing things if a text so full of that was set aside?
Those are absolutely the right questions to be asking. And they really get to the heart of how complex this whole topic of Scripture and its origins is. There just aren't easy black and white answers here. Anyone who claims there are is probably simplifying things too much. It really pushes us to admit that figuring out the canon was, and maybe still is, a very human process. Guided by God, yes, believers would say, but involving discernment, debate, cultural factors. The line between what made it in and what was left out wasn't always some bright, obvious line in the sand. It was discussed, prayed over, wrestled with for centuries. It definitely wasn't like the list just dropped down from heaven fully formed. It was a journey.
Exactly. And as we're thinking through this, it's clear these aren't just questions for scholars. I know many of you listening probably ponder similar things. Actually, we got 2 really insightful questions from a listener, Melissa, that perfectly capture the core of this reflection. They frame where we can take these thoughts next. Let's hear Melissa's questions.
Hi everyone. Yeah, so the questions are, could the Book of Enoch been excluded not because it was weak or flawed, but because it felt too powerful, too potent or unsettling for the developing structure of the canon? And the second one, if the Book of Enoch had remained in the Bible, how might Christian theology, especially ideas around angels, judgment, or the afterlife, been developed differently?
Those are powerful questions, Melissa.
Yeah.
They really invite us to think about that human and spiritual dimension of how the canon was formed. Because the process was gradual, it was complex, it was shaped by real people in real situations, prayer, councils, cultural shifts, theological debates, moments of crisis. It wasn't abstract. It unfolded over centuries as communities wrestled with what texts truly carry God's authority for us.
Melissa, your first question about it maybe being too powerful, unsettling. That's a really interesting way to look at it. Maybe it's incredibly detailed cosmology, all the specifics about angels and their fall. Perhaps that framework felt just too expansive, or maybe too easily twisted or misinterpreted, especially for a young church trying to nail down core beliefs and fend off what they saw as heresies. It's almost like imagine having this amazing, sprawling fan fiction based on a classic novel. People love it, it's creative, but would you teach it in schools alongside the original classic as equally foundational?
Yeah.
Probably not, right? You appreciate it, but it serves a different function than the core text you're trying to establish.
I see. So it's not that the book is bad, rather, it's simply challenging to integrate it into the main storyline.
And the second question, Melissa's point about how theology might look different if Enoch had stayed in.
Oh, wow. Well, yeah, if Enoch had remained central, you'd have to imagine Christian thinking about angels would be way more detailed, probably more systematic. We'd likely talk a lot more about specific named angels, their hierarchies, their precise roles, the specifics of the Watcher's fall, our ideas about judgment. They might be even more vivid, more apocalyptic, maybe with more defined locations and processes like Enoch describes, and the afterlife. Concepts might be much more mapped out with that detailed cosmic geography rather than the more general pictures we often have. It could have led to a richer imagination in some ways, maybe, but perhaps also a more prescriptive or speculative level of detail that the broader church eventually decided wasn't really essential for core faith and practice. Books like Enoch, they really are powerful reminders that the boundary between sacred scripture and influential religious text wasn't always obvious or agreed upon by everyone at the same time.
So where does all this leave us today? If the canon is generally seen as closed for most Christians, how do we engage with a story like Enoch's with this dynamic, complex history?
Well, I think it means that if the list of books is settled for most, the story and how it was settled invites us to keep thinking, keep reflecting. It helps us understand how we got the Bible we have. It encourages us to appreciate the diversity of thought in the early centuries and to see the nuance, how communities, guided by prayer and dealing with real-world challenges, wrestled with these texts and eventually came to a consensus about what would guide them. It challenges us to look beyond just the table of contents and really appreciate the human and divine drama behind it all.
So the Book of Enoch might be missing from most of our Bibles, but it definitely hasn't disappeared from history, has it? Its echoes are still there. In those New Testament verses, in the kinds of visions people had, and absolutely in the kinds of questions it makes us ask even now. Maybe not capital S scripture for most, but still a voice, perhaps not official doctrine, but still like a whisper from the ancient world, asking us to think about the edges of our own understanding and the amazing journey of faith itself. So, if this deep dive sparked something for you, if it got you thinking or wondering, please let us know. What should we explore next? Is there another forgotten book you're curious about? Or maybe a theme in the Bible you keep noticing and want to unpack? Or just a question about faith or history that's been on your mind? Drop us a comment or send a message. Seriously, your input really helps shape where we go next. And hey, if you're curious to actually see some of the visions Enoch described, the really vivid stuff, definitely check out our Enoch Shorts playlist on the channel. It tries to bring some of that ancient imagery to life.